Hello everyone, this is Sam from Language Atlas, and in this video I'd like to show you the Spanish A2 Anki deck. We will handle three things. First, I'd like to show you the course structure. Second, I'll show you the course content, and I'll do this by focusing on three decks so you can have a practical understanding of what it's like to practice with the Spanish A2 Anki deck. Third, I will show you some brief editing options. Now you can look in the description for timestamps if you want to just move around a little bit. Now before we get started, I'd like to mention one thing. You can see that there are actually two decks. We have the European Spanish A2 and the Latin American Spanish A2. And the European Spanish A2 refers to the Spanish that is spoken in Spain. Now when you get the Spanish A2 Anki deck, you can choose which one you want, the European Spanish versus the Latin American Spanish. Please just use one of the two, whichever it is, it's your choice, but just focus on one of them. Now, normally you just double click on whichever one you want to use. However, I've already done so for you. You can see over here, they're already loaded. You have the European Spanish A2 and the Latin American Spanish A2. And I'll just get started with my first point, which is the course structure. I'll begin with the European version and then I'll go to the Latin American one. So we have the card types deck, but I like to ignore this for now, but we'll come back to it a bit later. And we can see that there are 7 chapters. So I'll just begin with chapter 1. We have chapter 1 pronouns, and in this chapter we'll learn everything that's necessary for pronouns for Spanish A2. How to say anything and something, someone and anyone, another and other, and of course the direct object pronouns and indirect object pronouns, and even to the possessive pronouns. Everything you need to know for Spanish A2 pronouns. We have chapter 2 verbs. We have 3 tenses and a little bit on verbs and time. So tense 1, we have the preterite tense. When do you actually use this? And then how do you use the regular verbs in this tense, the AR, ER, and IR verbs. And then we have the common irregular verbs. These are irregular verbs that you tend to use on a common basis. Think of to go, to hear, to want, to be, to have, tener, and ser, etc. Everything that you need to know. Then we have some irregular verb groups. There are certain verb groups that are irregular, which you need to know. And then we have tense 2, which is the imperfect tense. And when do you actually use the imperfect tense? Some regular verbs, AR, ER, but some other verbs that are regular in the imperfect tense. We have some common irregular verbs. Think of again the tener and the ser, the common ones. We have tense 3, which is the present perfect tense. When do you use the present perfect tense? Some regular verbs in the present perfect tense, and finally some common irregular verbs in the present perfect tense. And this is the verbs and time. And you can see over here we have the irregular gerunds, the imperfect progressive tense, and some contrasts, some preterites versus the present perfect, and the recent past. That's that for chapter 2 verbs. We'll go to chapter 3 idioms. So we have ago, we have obligation, you have some contrast, how to say like, not yet. Essentially just a lot of idioms that you need to know for Spanish A2. We have chapter 4, articles and nouns, and just a simple one. There's certain nouns that are singular in Spanish but plural in English and the other way around, so vice versa. Chapter 5, adjectives and adverbs. And again, we focus a bit more on adjective and adverbs, of course. We have a complete guide to Spanish adjectives. We have how to make comparisons, quantitative adjectives, essentially everything you need to know for that in Spanish A2. We have chapter 6, questions and interrogatives. We'll deal with some contrast here. For example, 2 ways to say por qué, and because versus why. Of course, they're spelled different, so essentially it's just 2 words. But again, we have some other ways to say how, where, and when, how many and how much. So things you need to know of that nature. Chapter 7, we have prepositions and conjunctions. How to say before and after, from, until, or from to. How to express cause, duration, all the important things. And of course, por versus para. We handled it a little bit in A1, but we do it a lot more in A2. Now that's that for the European Spanish one. I'd like to show you the Latin American Spanish one too. So if you maximize the Latin American version, we can see that structurally it's the same. However, you may ask yourself, well, what is the difference then? And the difference lies in what's inside. So when you do a certain example of idioms, the examples that you see, the sentences that you see inside are different. A notable example is, of course, that in Latin America they don't use vosotros. Of course, pronunciation will be different, and essentially it's the sentences that are inside where you can find the big differences. Now, I've shown you the overall course structure, and now I'd like to show you a few decks. I'll show you 2 decks of European Spanish A2, and then I'll show you 1 deck of Latin American Spanish A2, so you can get a better picture of what you'll actually be doing when you get the deck. So I'll maximize the European Spanish A2 Anki deck to show you the first deck that we'll practice. So I'll go to verbs, regular verbs in the pretrit, and then the regular AR verbs deck. Now this is the first of the 3 decks that we'll show you. And the first question type is this. You see that there's a blank area and you have to know what goes here. So there's a Spanish sentence with a blank and you have to know what goes here, and you can do it by conjugating the verb, and over here we have the tense. And there's an English translation, and there's a picture for you to create an association with said sentence. Now this will help you in remembering things. Do you know the answer?
Él llamó a la oficina ayer por la tarde.
And as you can see, you should have known that the ending was an O. And you can see the ending over here too. You have the English sentence, and if you press this or click the R key, you can hear it again.
Él llamó a la oficina ayer por la tarde.
And as I mentioned before, you can see how to conjugate things. You can see what the conjugation method is. So you have the AR, you take that AR away and you add a new ending. And in our case, it was the O with an accent. And even more below, we can see a link to the article on the website, should you want to see that. Now that was the first question type. You can see a blank area and you have to know what goes in said blank area. I'd now like to show you the second question type. And if you had it correct, you can click on this, or you can click space or 3.
Vosotros, yo dice, nosotros, encontrar, ellos cambian, tú bailas.
Now this is the second question type. You can see that there's a blank as we saw before, but now you have to type in the correct answer. And this tests whether you know how to spell the correct answer.
Él llamó a la oficina ayer por la tarde.
And as you can see, I typed in the correct answer. It's completely green, and you can see it again in green over here if you want to see it one more time. But what if you didn't know the correct answer? What if you just typed in something?
Vosotros cenasteis antes de que yo llegara.
Then Anki will correct you, as you've seen over here. So even if you make a mistake, you will still know how to do it properly. And again, everything that you saw before is still over here. Now that's the second question type. I'd like to go to the third one, which is a translating one.
Yo di nos ellos tú bailas.
The third question type is that you see a Spanish sentence and you have to know the correct English translation.
Él llamó a la oficina ayer por la tarde.
And this tests whether you can translate from Spanish to English. And there's one more question type.
Vosotros, yo di nosotros ellos tú bailas.
Again, you see an English sentence and now you have to translate to Spanish, so this tests whether you know it in Spanish.
Él llamó a la oficina ayer por la tarde.
So this is the first deck that I wanted to show you. Now we'll go to another deck. There's something that a lot of people are very much interested in, por versus para. Let's do that one for the second deck. And again, it's the same concept. You can see a Spanish sentence with a blank and you have to know what goes there.
Hay muchos ciervos por el bosque.
In this case, it's por. You can see an explanation how to use por and rough indications of location, through the place, etc. Para as well. There's some examples of when you should use that. Again, everything you see here for por versus para is moderated for A2 level, so there are more examples and more ways, but this is just for A2 level. Let's do another one. And again, you see a sentence, a blank area, and you have to know what goes there.
No dejes esta caja aquí, va para la cocina.
And in this case, it's para. One more.
Necesito que lleves a los niños para el colegio.
And in this case, it was para two. So this way you can practice whether to use por or para, and something that I think is really useful. Now that is that for the European Spanish A2 deck. I'd now like to show you an example of the Latin American deck. So I'll maximize the Latin American deck. And again, as we've seen, it's the same structure. But I like to go to an idiom one. And I like to go to this one. Study now. And you can see it's the same setup. Again, there's a blank. But now I'll press enter and you may see a difference.
De pequeña yo sabía tocar el piano, pero me he olvidado.
Now I said see, but the better word was actually here, because you may have noticed that the pronunciation is different. Listen one more time.
De pequeña yo sabía tocar el piano, pero me he olvidado.
And the reason that the pronunciation is different is because the Spanish that is spoken in Spain differs from the one that is spoken in Latin America. So a very noticeable thing that you will have probably noticed is that the pronunciation is different in the Latin American deck. Of course, the sentences are different too. You'll see no vosotros examples in the Latin American deck. Let's do another one. What do you think? Know the correct answer?
Jugamos al trivial.
And again, just to highlight the pronunciation.
Jugamos al trivial.
The sentences in the Latin American deck are different than the one from the Spanish one, or the European Spanish one, I should mention. One more.
Tu hijo se pasa todo el día jugando a la PlayStation.
Your son spends all day playing PlayStation. Probably something you may or may not know about. So we'll go back, and these are some decks that I wanted to show you. So one more time, there's a difference between European Spanish, Latin American Spanish. Choose whichever one you're practicing. And finally, I'd like to show you some brief editing options. After maximizing the European Spanish A2 deck, you can see there's a subdeck called card types. You saw the same thing in Latin American one. But why is it here? What is the purpose of it? I'll show you. If you go to browse, you can see it's right over here, card types. Now, normally you were tested in 4 ways. You saw a blank area and you had to know what goes in the blank area. The second one is that there was a blank field and you had to type in the blank field. And then you saw something in Spanish, you had to know it in English. And you saw something in English, you had to know it in Spanish. Now, 4 ways to be tested can be quite a lot for some people. Therefore, there's also the beginner-friendly option, where you have no translation at all. When you get the deck, by default, it will be in the beginner-friendly one. Personally, I prefer this, and I think this suffices for most people. Some people, however, like to translate too, and for those, you have those 2 additional options. But how can you switch from one to another? You drag the card type up, go to Browse, European Spanish or Latin American Spanish, and you can see right now there are 4 ways that you can be tested. 1, 2, 3, 4. Control A, Command A. Then you can go to Change Note Type. And we can go to the beginner friendly one if you want to have just 2 ways that will be tested. Okay. Yes. You can see there are just 2 ways that you can be tested. 2, 2, 1, 2. If you regret your choice and like to go back, very simple. Control A, Command A. Change Note Type. Beginner friendly to language atlas card. Okay. And 1, 2, 3, 4. It's that simple. For most people, I'd say just stick with the beginner friendly one, which is the one that you get when you purchase the deck. Close this, and I'd like to show you one more thing. When you go to options, you can actually change how many new cards you can see per day. So if you want to decrease it to 40, for example, and how many reviews you see per day, or do per day, I should say, 20. So you can see it's changed now. Now you can change these settings to what you prefer personally. My advice would be start with a low number and work your way up. It is better to do little but work your way up, because this way you'll create a habit. And if you start with something really big, probably you will not maintain this habit and stop learning. So choose a smaller number, a lower number, and work your way up. And that's that for this lesson. I'd like to thank you so much for watching. Please go to languageatlas.com if you have any questions, like to see the decks, you have more information. There's some information in the description. Please comment if you have any questions. You can send an email too. Thank you for watching. Good luck with Spanish, and I wish you a very good day. Goodbye.